Thank you again, everyone, for taking time out of your day, especially during Domestic Violence Awareness Month, to be here for our final and fourth addition to Measuring Safety this year. We're really excited for today's launch. And I want to start by introducing myself and our team here. My name is Maralia Negron. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Research at the network advocating against domestic violence. My wonderful team. So I'm going to turn it over to Shelby and Megan to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, my name is Shelby Hoffman Pinder. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as manager of our policy advocacy and research team. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation, and I'll pass it over to Megan.
Hi, good morning. My name is Megan Merrill, and I am the Systems Advocacy Coordinator here at the network. I am part of the Policy Advocacy and Research team.
But again, thank you so much for being here today for our final report launch of the year. This report is available on our website, the-network.org, under our Policy and Advocacy tab, and you can go ahead and download it. We also do have a social media toolkit for those of you who are looking to use graphs and charts and some of the data from this edition in your social media. So we would encourage you to use that tool as well and download that. But why don't we go ahead and dive into Measuring Safety Gender-Based Violence Services edition in Illinois. So for today, we're going to be looking at specifically measuring safety, kind of an overview again of what this report is and why we here at the network do the report. We're also going to be covering where we pull this data from. And then we're going to be highlighting domestic violence services across Illinois. We're going to be looking specifically at the number of clients, looking at client demographics, so who's receiving services, and then types of services provided. And then we're going to be looking at sexual violence services. And this is the first year, again, that we are doing kind of a multi-year look back for sexual violence services provided across Illinois. And we're going to be covering the same information. We're going to be covering number of clients served, client demographics, and types of services. So who are we at the network? For those of you who might be joining us for our first report, if this is your first report launch with us, the network leads a coalition of direct service providers working to end gender-based violence through direct services. And so we reach our survivors through the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, and that report launched kind of looking at calls across Illinois to the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline was launched earlier this year. It was our first series in our Measuring Safety series report. So we would encourage you to give that a look if you haven't already. Again, available on our website for download. We also serve our member organizations through training and resources. And finally, we advocate for policies that improve the lives of survivors. What is measuring safety? So measuring safety started in 2020, and it is a key component of the work that we do here in our policy advocacy and research team. And so this year was the first year that we started to serialize the editions of measuring safety, kind of having a key focus for each report. And the reports are really a tool for advocacy. They're a tool for expanding and advocating for expanding service and also for public education. So really looking at the importance and value that direct service brings to our communities and to our survivors across the state. And this specific edition is looking at services received and where maybe we are outmatched in terms of service needs and services received. And so this is really a tool to also celebrate the direct work that our direct service providers, some of which I know are on the call, do every single day. So thank you so much for that work. This series and edition is really for you, a celebration of that work. And we want to be really clear that measuring safety is not a scientific study. We're not making, kind of we're hypothesizing here and there of why we think we're seeing some of the trends in services, but it's not a scientific study at all backed by kind of data and research, really. It's more of a snapshot, a contemporary snapshot of services received throughout Illinois. So our main data source where we pull all of our data from is InfoNet. And InfoNet is a web-based system that is administered by the Illinois Criminal Justice Information Authority, and domestic violence and sexual assault providers throughout the state enter data on clients and the services that they're providing in this database. And so ICJA is able to provide aggregate data to us that we then turn into this amazing report. It's really important to note some of the data limitations on this report and on InfoNet data generally. Not every single category is required to be put in by service providers when they're engaging with clients. So some of the data you'll see, and we've done our best to kind of indicate throughout the report, when some data is unknown or unreported, we do disclose that if we are including that data throughout the report. And then it's also important to note that not all providers of domestic violence and sexual assault services use InfoNet for all of their services. And this is in particularly important when we talk about community-based service providers, kind of grassroots organizations that are just starting. They may not be using InfoNet. It is a free service. So if any of those providers are on the call, we would encourage you to start. And our team is happy to support in that endeavor of getting you started in using InfoNet. But it's important to note that those individuals who are not using InfoNet, that data is not reported here. And it's also important to note that low reporting totals are kept confidential, and that domestic violence and sexual assault agencies do record hours differently. So we would discourage folks to try and kind of base-to-base numbers, because there are guidance, and every organization has internal guidance of how they best report and capture some of this information. We also wanted to really make note that we recognize that services are not provided in a vacuum, and there have been significant recent federal cuts to VOCA funding, while the state has also increased dollars for domestic violence services. And so this isn't a formal evaluation of the impact that these budget constraints and funding streams have had on services. That's really outside of the scope of this report. And we do hope eventually to have some more statistical significant information on the way that dollars have been put to use specifically from state funding, and how federal VOCA cuts have impacted that kind of increase in state funding with a match of decrease in federal funding. However, we want to make specific mention that VOCA cuts have disproportionately impacted sexual assault service providers. And there are some quotes throughout that section of the report that really highlight how these cuts have impacted those providers specifically. And we know that there's more work to be done to make sure that there is consistent funding for this sector to ensure that survivors are getting the critical services that they need. And that is absolutely part of the work that we do here in our policy advocacy and research team. We want to give a special thank you to the providers. I know I made a plug for it earlier, but for the providers that do this work every single day across the state. The work is really tiring work. It's hard work, and you are the foundation for this report. And we also want to give a special thanks to the direct service providers who took time out of their day to talk to us here at the network. In our focus groups, as I mentioned earlier, there are quotes from providers throughout the report that really give color to what we're seeing in the data. So, talking to staff, and this year we specifically took very careful mention of culturally specific programs and the importance that culturally specific services have for survivors when presenting and receiving and asking for services. And so I want to thank you. We also want to thank the survivors who took the time to speak with us about their lived experience for the report. Without their voices, we know that these data points and statistics would really fall short to tell the full story of what it means to be a survivor receiving services in Illinois, and also what the impact of services have had on their lived experience. And so we really would encourage you to take note. We are going to cover a couple of them in today's presentation, but for their safety, they do remain anonymous. And so we just want to thank them again. Okay, well, now we're ready to kind of dive into what domestic violence services look like here in Illinois, and I will pass it to my colleague Shelby to lead this part of the presentation.
Thanks, Marlita. We're going to open with our domestic violence services and specifically kind of just taking a broad look at the scope of those services. So, how many folks are receiving services across the state, and what does that sort of division of services across the state look like? To kick us off, let's look at those 2023 totals. In 2023, domestic violence programs served a remarkable more than 360,000 service hours to just under 51,700 clients across the state. I think it is really remarkable that we are able to say that survivors are served in the tens of thousands here in Illinois. And it seems to me that we've got a really robust service environment here to talk about. You'll see here we have a trend graph looking both pre and post COVID at client capacity over time. Of course, we all know that the pandemic impacted our service environment in a number of ways, how we access services, where we think to look, right? And since COVID, we have seen a slow but relatively steady increase in services. So 2023 saw a 6% increase in clients served compared to 2022, part of that sort of post-COVID growth. But we have yet to sort of reach the height of services before COVID, which neared 56,000 clients. We're really excited this year to be able to provide you with a little bit more geographic information about services as well. So you'll see here a regional map that breaks down the number of clients served in each region of the state. And what I'll name for us first is that this is counting based on where the provider is located. So if a provider is located in central Illinois, for example, all of the clients they serve are added to that central Illinois total, regardless of where those clients actually live, right? And what you'll see here is that the map largely reflects the population density across the state. The most clients served are here in Cook County, which is also, of course, the densest population in the state. But there is one exception. We did find that Central Illinois did serve slightly more folks than the collar counties, even though the collar counties tend to be slightly more dense in population. So this tracks, I think, for us overall, but we did want to flag that one place where the numbers are sort of swapped. Really across the state, regardless of what region you are in, we are seeing thousands of survivors being served, anywhere from that high point of just over 19,000 clients being served in Cook County to the smallest regional service capacity, which is in Northern Illinois with just over 4,000 clients served. We are also able to share some information at the city level. And this is specifically looking at where clients live. So unlike that last map we looked at, this map reflects the zip code in every client's residence information. And this map reflects, of course, only the clients who were able to access services through an InfoNet-based provider. So there certainly are survivors who we know are receiving services that are not reflected in this map because perhaps they are working with a small community-based organization that doesn't use InfoNet, for example. And of course, this is only capturing survivors who actually access services. And so I would really encourage folks to think of this map as a puzzle piece. This reflects service access across the city. And another piece of that puzzle that might be valuable to look at is a similar map that we have in volume one of Measuring Safety that looks at calls to the hotline, the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline, from across the city of Chicago. We tend to conceive of those calls as reflection of need, as opposed to this map, which is really a reflection of access. And putting those pieces of information together can be really valuable context. The number one thing we want folks to take away from this map is just understanding that access to services varies by community. And this is a great opportunity for us to identify places where survivors are perhaps not accessing services as routinely and think about ways that we can expand service opportunities in those spaces. I'll hand it back over to Marlia to talk us through a little bit about what these clients look like and who they are now that we know how many folks were served.
Thanks so much, Shelby. We really are excited about those last two maps that we covered in the slides. So we really hope that you all will take a moment to give them a look. But we'll move on to client demographics for our domestic violence section of the report. So client gender and sexuality. So here you'll see that 84% of clients that received services across Illinois identified as female, with 16% identifying as male, and less than 1% identifying as transgender, gender nonconforming, or another category. And you'll see here that 6% of clients identified as LGBTQ+, which is in alignment with Illinois' general population. However, we also know that there are a lot of barriers and stigmas that come along with disclosing LGBTQ+ identity. And so we just make a quick mention here that there may be more that can be done to ensure that we are reaching out and being culturally sensitive and making sure that survivors have the support they need and would like in disclosing their identity. Client age, we know that the largest plurality of clients were between the age of 30 and 39 years old, and 50% of clients were between 20 and 39 years of age, and 84% of clients were adults, with 16% of clients being children. And we think it's important to note here too as well that when children indicated, it's because they were also receiving services. There are other sections of the report that make reference to survivors who share their parenting status, but unless an actual child receives services, this is where they'd actually be captured in terms of clients. Client race and language. It's really important here to note that race data is reported mutually exclusive in these categories. So what that means is at intake, if a survivor identifies as multiple race categories and they are checking through those boxes and they check through more than one, they would be placed in that multiple races category, coming in at 2%. It's important to also note that the majority of clients at 56% identify as people of color, with the largest plurality of clients were white non-Latino at 44%. And, again, these are mutually exclusive. So really, I think putting this into perspective of how this relates to our demographics across Illinois is really important. We know that 27% of all clients receiving services identify as Black or African American, and that is more than our general population here in Illinois, and same thing with Hispanic and Latino. And then top 4 non-English languages among all domestic violence service clients in 2023 were Spanish, coming in at 1, with 79% of survivors who were receiving services in a non-English language were receiving that service in Spanish. And then second to that was Polish, coming in at 5%. 4% for Arabic, and then 2% for Korean. And 4,629 clients sought services across 40 non-English languages. So there are a variety of languages that folks can receive services in. This is just the top 4 that we saw folks were receiving services in. Primary presenting violence type, we know that a survivor's lived experience can be really layered. There can be a multitude of types of abuse presenting throughout their lived experience. But really, we would like readers and folks who are joining today's presentation to really look at this information as the incident or type of violence that drove the survivor to seek services when they're working with that direct service provider. And so you'll see that 49% indicated physical domestic violence and 48% emotional domestic violence, with 3% indicating sexual domestic violence. Um, really kind of focusing again on the fact that these are evenly split. And we would also make mention that this is consistent with our findings in our first edition of our Measuring Safety series on the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline Report, which really does show that when callers call, they are indicating at the same rate both emotional violence and physical violence. And as I mentioned earlier, we do really make very specific mentions from interviews we did with staff with culturally responsive providers. And we have a couple profiles worked in throughout. So we would really encourage you to take some time to look at those profiles. We have quotes directly from staff talking about what it means to be able to meet survivors in that language, in that native language, with the cultural humility that they need. To really meet survivors where they are. And I also want to make a quick plug for the fact that we do have a wide range of other demographic data available in the report, including educational status, parenting status, marital status, and disability status. All right, and I'll pass it back to Shelby to cover our types of services.
We are very fortunate here in Illinois to have a very wide range of services available to survivors across the state. And that range really allows providers to meet survivors where they are and support them, regardless of sort of where they are in their own journey with domestic violence. That might be supporting someone who is currently in an actively dangerous situation, who perhaps needs tools to safety plan and to maintain their well being while they come up with a way to leave if that is what they want. It might look like creating space for somebody that is safe as they separate themselves, or giving them the tools to do that with protection, for example, under the law. And it often looks like supporting someone even when their experience of violence is far behind them and they seek the tools to have an emotionally and mentally well state of mind as they recover perhaps from all of the trauma that comes from gender-based violence. And we're, I think, very proud to be able to say that there's such a wide range of those services available. What we did for this report is really zero in on those top 10 types of services, the major service categories. So you may see a few things absent from this list that you do as a provider, but we tried to cover as many of those as we could. And what you'll see here is a top 10 list, the services that were received by the most number of clients throughout the year. You'll see that number one on this list is civil legal advocacy for orders of protection, which was received by almost half of all clients who received services across the state. 47% of clients at some point at least had a discussion with their advocate about legal advocacy. We also see topping this list counseling services, both in person and telephone based, and some other great services listed there as well. One thing that we think is important to flag when we look at this list is that many of the top services that were provided last year also align with the needs that were identified in Volume 1 of Measuring Safety when we looked at what people asked for when they called the Illinois Domestic Violence Hotline for help. And while it is great to know that our service providers are really being responsive to client needs and finding that topical alignment, it's often not aligned in scale. So for example, Shelter both makes this top 10 service provision list and was the number one need articulated to callers to the hotline last year. In fact, the hotline received just under 18,000 requests for shelter in 2023. And while it was a top 10 item provided last year, it was only provided to 7,628 clients, right? So there is still quite a gulf between the need that has been articulated and the capacity that our providers have demonstrated this past year. And I think we'll see this really play out in some of our discussion later today. We do also this year take a look at average hours spent with a client in each service category. And we think this is really valuable perspective because it allows us to see that sometimes services that aren't provided particularly widely are not available widely because they are our most time and resource intensive services, where the highest number of hours on average are being spent with clients in order to receive that service and to really provide it well. When we look at this list, which includes things like supervised visitation, counseling, therapy, different forms of attorney services, we see that they are typically going to be longer term services, clinical services, or legal services, all of which require supporting someone for long durations of time, perhaps through complex situations. Um, we just want to name and uplift really that just because a service isn't provided very widely doesn't mean that that service isn't very rich. And I think we can see that the amount of time that goes into these services is really remarkable. Okay, so we're going to jump into some of the major categories of services here. We're going to start with housing services, and there are a number of different kinds of housing services available to folks. You'll see here that there are transitional housing services, off-site shelter services, on-site shelter services, and housing advocacy services. Those first three are going to be providing literal housing or shelter to someone. And housing advocacy is a little different. So we're not going to be literally housing someone with that service, but we might be supporting them related to their housing. So for example, educating someone on their rights under the Safe Homes Act and helping them act on and enforce those rights. The trends here over the last 3 years reflect to us that there has been sort of a shift away from off-site shelter services and towards on-site shelter services as we kind of move away from COVID and lift so many of those restrictions that shaped our off-site service environment. But we do want to note, of course, that still more than 1,000 people in 2023 received offsite shelter services. And we certainly think that that is a reflection that offsite shelter services are here to stay. We certainly had a lot of learning and creativity and flexibility that went into really building out our infrastructure here. And there are lots of ways in which these offsite shelter services are able to accommodate survivors who perhaps wouldn't otherwise be able to access or be a strong fit for those on-site shelter services. So we've seen a move back towards on-site shelter, but do expect that those will continue to be available in off-site shelters as well. We do have data about housing services available by region as well, which is quite interesting. I think this really illuminates for us that across the state, housing options are quite different for survivors. So we can see here that Central Illinois really leads the state in providing on-site shelter, having provided it to more than 2,000 clients last year. Whereas the collar counties really lead the state in providing that off-site shelter. And Cook County leads the state in providing transitional housing. This, of course, reflects that depending on where a survivor lives in the state, their options might be limited. And this might be a really valuable tool for organizations who are looking for ways to expand their services and perhaps address gaps in their community. Because we can see quite clearly here that, for example, like Southern Illinois in our transitional housing graph has very few transitional housing options in comparison to something like Cook County. So it's a good way of kind of being able to think about where there are gaps in our environment and what we might be able to do to better serve survivors over time. And there were several pieces of information that emerged when we looked at our housing services data that really indicated that we have a bit of a bottleneck in our housing system right now. And I'll walk you through those pieces kind of one by one here. At the top of this slide, you'll see the average number of days that clients are in shelter. And in the last 3 years, that has substantially grown. It's increased to 10 days from 48 days in 2021 to 58 days in 2023. And shelter is meant to be sort of an emergency temporary tool, right? And then we move folks into a longer term arrangement. So when our shelter times expand, it may reflect that there is something causing a holdup that makes it difficult to move out of that temporary shelter into a more stable long term environment. We also see here that housing services time has increased pretty dramatically in the last few years. So the number of clients who received housing advocacy services increased about 7% in the last 3 years, but the time spent on those services increased by 21%. And that again kind of indicates that something might be creating challenges in the larger housing environment that are requiring advocates to spend more time with the same amount of clients in order to address their clients' needs. We also see another piece of this puzzle when we look at turnaway counts across the state. There is always a little bit of duplication that happens when we count turnaways because we count turnaways from any individual shelter. We don't count turnaways from the individual person. But we can see here that 2023, for the first time in the last 3 years, turnaways from shelter actually outpaced people who were sheltered. So even though in the last 3 years we have been able to increase shelter capacity by about 10%, we've seen a 23% increase in shelter turnaways. I think one way to really clearly illustrate the bottleneck problem actually emerged when we did our measuring safety report earlier this year, volume one, that looked at the hotline, where we found that there were 124 days where there were no beds or cribs available in Chicago DV shelters. That's more than a third of the year. And that was a substantial increase from 2022, right? So when all of those beds are full and we are no longer able to move clients through to the next sort of phase in our system, people who are looking for a safe place to go suddenly have nowhere to go. And that bottleneck is something we think is a big gap and something that requires investment to expand our capacity, both in emergency shelter services, but also in providing that safe, affordable, long-term housing options for survivors. Just to quickly name here, we do have lots of wonderful quotes from our providers who participated in focus groups this year that Maralia mentioned earlier. Those are throughout the report. Here is a quote from one of our providers, Con Nguyen, talking specifically about the importance of housing services among their clients. And so I would encourage you all, as you flip through the report, to watch out for these little bubbles with quotes directly from providers, as they add really valuable context to a lot of our conversations about services and ensuring that those services are accessible to all clients. Okay, we'll go ahead and shift gears a little bit now and talk about our legal system services, which are quite varied. You'll see that they're available to folks both in group settings and individual settings, and through two different kinds of staff, our legal advocacy staff and our attorney staff. So you'll see all of those listed out here. Legal advocacy, specifically for orders of protection, remains the number one service provided rather across the state this year, and has been for the last several years. 47% of all clients receive some form of civil legal advocacy in 2023. One trend I want to draw your attention to here on this chart is that attorney services have seen a really marked increase over the last 3 years. And there's sort of three different categories for attorney services, all of which saw a boost. We hypothesized a little bit in the report that this may be related to the investment that the city of Chicago made with ARPA dollars that were specifically targeted at legal services. We know from our earlier discussion that those attorney services are often some of the most time and resource intensive services. So expanding the actual client capacity there is super valuable and a really promising reflection. The other major trend I would draw our attention to is that while most of these services have gone up as overall client capacity has increased, criminal legal advocacy regarding charges specifically has steadily decreased in the last 3 years. And that might be reflective of a number of things, right? That might be reflective of client preference in perhaps moving away from the criminal legal system as a tool, but that also could just be reflective of increasing challenges there that might make the system difficult to navigate for folks. One thing we wanted to call out, since legal advocacy for orders of protection is such a core component of DV services, is what OP filings have looked like over time. They've been steadily increasing over the last few years, with more than 16,000 OPs filed by domestic violence services clients specifically in 2023. And those were filed by just under 15,000 clients. So sometimes one client does file more than one order of protection. That might be because they are being subjected to violence by more than one person, or they may file and then have a case dropped and then file again later. Um, Something that is worth flagging here is the incredibly high rate at which orders of protection that are filed by DV services clients are granted. We see that a remarkable 80% of those are granted when filed. And we think that this is a really promising reflection of the credibility among clients, the serious nature of the violence they're facing, and the high quality of submissions that are going before the court with the help of a legal advocate. Of course, we would love to compare this to the general population of orders filed, and unfortunately, that data isn't public. But we do think that this is a very substantially high number, and likely reflects the high quality work that is coming out of our legal advocacy programs. Here is another example of something to keep your eyes peeled for in the report. We have several very powerful stories coming directly from survivors who participated in interviews this year. This is the story of Caleb speaking directly to experience with legal and institutional advocacy. And we think that these stories are so important. They offer context about what these services are like to receive. And then for the folks who didn't receive services, they really illuminate what need feels like in all these different ways. And if you do nothing else, we would really encourage you to take a look at all the survivor stories in the report. Counseling services are also available in many shapes and sizes across the state. The two big kind of groupings here that I will flag are therapy services, which are those clinical services, versus counseling services, which are going to be that more general emotional support related services. As with on and off-site shelter kind of transitioning post-COVID, we do see a bit of a transition from telephone to in-person counseling. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. The other trend we'd like to draw your attention to here is really that there has been a reduction in individual and group therapy services, and a bit of an increase then in group counseling services. We have a guess that this could be a bit of a compensation tool, right? We aren't able to make that time for those clinical services, but perhaps we're giving someone a group support environment. But there could be other things going on here as well, of course. Pivoting to that post-COVID shift that we've seen between telephone and in-person counseling, we have seen telephone counseling go from being the dominant form of counseling in the last 3 years and really shifting to in-person counseling once again. This might reflect client preference to some extent as the COVID regulations have lifted. We will again flag here, though, that telephone counseling is here to stay. We know that it makes counseling accessible to so many clients who, for a variety of reasons, wouldn't be able to make it to an office to receive those services. So, knowing that, tens of thousands of survivors have received this service last year, and we expect that they will continue to receive it in large volume moving forward. Of course, there are also a variety of economic and life skill services that are available to clients who might need tools to sort of build their own new life separate from a person causing harm, or need tools to escape a person causing harm. These cover a wide range of things, anywhere from education and employment assistance to life skills like cooking classes and things like that, conflict resolution. And two of the higher categories here are related to transportation services and economic assistance services, both of which saw a pretty big jump in the last few years. We hypothesize in the report that this could be related to the pilot transportation program that the network is operating with RTA, which has distributed 25,000 venture cards to survivors through their providers across the RTA region. And it seems like that could be impacting those transportation numbers to some effect. We also see a growth in economic assistance, which we guess could be related to, at least in part, the radical expansion of our survivor fund, which makes direct cash assistance payments to survivors in various different localities. If you're interested in more of the work specifically related to our Survivor Fund, Volume 2 of Measuring Safety did cover that work in really great detail. It's available on our website, and we think there's a lot of really powerful findings there and would serve as a great model for other folks interested in doing cash assistance work. Last but not least, in our service categories are services that are specifically aimed at children and teens. We see a similar sort of reduction in individual counseling and shift towards group counseling here, which again might indicate a lack of staff capacity to work with folks one-on-one. We're largely seeing patterns here that mirror those in adult services. I'll pass it back over to Maralia to talk a little bit about our sexual violence services.
Thanks so much, Shelby. Jumping into sexual violence services, we're going to be talking about the number of clients served. We're excited to, again, have expanded this portion of the report to include a 3-year look back. Specifically for total sexual assault clients served over time, we do have a lengthier look back for this just to really get a closer look at the pre and post COVID impact. And you'll see here that unfortunately we still are on a decline for total clients served over time, with this year specifically experiencing a 5% decrease, which we do attribute to in large part, hypothetically, to VOCA cuts. But we also would like to highlight that sexual assault programs did provide a total of 108,097 hours of direct services across 10,593 clients this year. And we again want to celebrate their work in the midst of what we know has been a very challenging budget year. And so in this slide, and again throughout this section of the report, we do provide voices on the funding crisis. And this quote specifically is from a rape crisis center, talking to the network about the ramifications that VOCA cuts have had on being able to meet survivors where they are and provide those critical services. Okay, so who received services with sexual violence providers? 92% of those who received services in 2023 were the survivor themselves. And very interesting in sexual violence services, they also do provide significant others who can be family or a chosen family of that survivor to receive services with that service provider, and 8% of all clients were that significant other of that survivor's choosing in 2023. Now we're going to dive into client demographics. And client gender and sexuality is highlighted here on this slide, with 86% of survivors identifying as female, 11% as male, and 3% as transgender, gender nonconforming, or another category. It's important to note that in terms of sexuality, 20% of clients identified as LGBTQ+, which really is an overrepresentation compared to the general population in Illinois. And this really suggests that sexual assault service providers have really done a lot to reach out to LGBTQ folks and ensure that those survivors are receiving the services that they need. And they've really fostered an environment where folks may be comfortable disclosing that identity. We also do know that sexual violence disproportionately impacts LGBTQ folks as well. Client race and language. Again, this category is mutually exclusive, and so anyone who indicates identifying as more than one race will be in that multiple races category, coming in at 4%. But the majority of clients did identify as white non-Latino at 53%. And we also want to make mention that 24% did identify as Hispanic or Latino, with 17% identifying as Black or African American. And 533 clients received services in 9 non-English languages, with the vast majority coming in at 95% of those who received services in another language outside of English were Spanish. Client age, here we want to emphasize that 64% of individuals were adults at 18 years or older, and 36% were children served. It's important to note that this data does not capture the work that child advocacy centers do, which is specifically targeted at those 18 and under, outside of the scope of this report. However, we do like to mention that we know that sexual assault clients do skew substantially younger than domestic violence clients, with the plurality of young people between the age of 0 and 19 making up 42% of clients served. And that really speaks to the prevalence of young individuals being kind of the focal point of some of the outreach efforts that our sexual violence service providers do, including programming on college campuses. And again, we highlight survivor stories as it relates to sexual violence. This survivor story specifically talks about sexual violence on campus and what that experience was as a student. And so we would again just encourage you to take some time to really read these impactful narratives. Primary presenting violence type. Again, we would encourage you to look at this as what drove the survivor to seek services from the service provider. And while we may automatically just assume sexual assault, there are a multitude of categories that are captured on this screen that folks can indicate. And so adult sexual abuse or abuse was coming in at 46% of all clients. Child sexual abuse or abuse generally is 40%, but there also are categories such as adult survivor of incest, other sexual violence, sexual harassment, stalking, and sex trafficking. And we also want to encourage you to take a closer look at that section of the report with demographics, because there is other data available, including education status, marital status, and disability status. And I'll pass it back to Shelby to cover our services section of this report.
Much like with our domestic violence services across the state, there are a wide variety of sexual assault services as well. Again, really able to meet survivors wherever they are in their experience, be it prevention work or immediate crisis intervention work, or perhaps supporting someone years after an incident of violence. This list here is our top 5 services received among clients in 2023, starting with that in-person counseling services, which were received by 44% of all clients in the state. Other items that top this list are general advocacy services, telephone counseling, medical advocacy, and criminal justice advocacy. As with our domestic violence services, we also took a look at the average hours spent with each client for each category of service and found a very similar pattern. Those clinical services and those legal services are going to be much more time and resource intensive. And all of those top this list here, as they did with our DV services list. As we jump into those individual service categories, you'll see that there are sort of 4 major forms of advocacy services that are provided by sexual assault service providers. Those include general advocacy, medical advocacy, and criminal and civil justice related advocacy. We have seen advocacy services reduce pretty uniformly over the last 3 years, which makes sense given that overall client capacity has decreased. However, one place we do want to draw your attention is with medical advocacy, which has had, I would say, the most shallow reduction over time, reflecting less than a 1% decrease from 2022 to 2023. And even as that reduction remains quite narrow, we have seen a growth in hours spent on medical advocacy services. So in the last 3 years, from 2021 to 2023, there was a 2% decrease in services overall going to clients related to medical advocacy, but hours have actually gone up by 9%, which suggests that there may be something going on in our medical system that demands more time of our medical advocates to provide the same quality of support to their clients. And that may be reflected in some of the reporting that's been done recently on some of the challenges that exist in our medical environment. The Measuring Safety report, specifically calls out a couple pieces of reporting related to those challenges. Things, for example, like shortages in SANE, which is sexual assault nurse examiner staff in hospitals, may be creating a situation where we have to spend more time with a client in order to provide them with the same degree of quality care and positive outcomes. We also have a variety of counseling services available to survivors of sexual assault, including those telephone and in-person counseling services, group-based counseling services, and counseling that is focused on the family unit. Here, as with our DV counseling services, we see a shift away from telephone services and towards in-person services over time, which likely again indicates client preference and potentially also organizational preference, getting that face-to-face time with folks to ensure that they're receiving the high quality support that they need. But as with telephone counseling and DV services, we think that it is likely that this is a tool that will stay, as it makes counseling very accessible to a whole group of folks who perhaps otherwise couldn't access it. There are just a couple other forms of service that don't fit neatly into those other categories. These include parent and guardian consultations and legal services from attorneys. And those consultations with parents and guardians are really a space to ensure that they are informed about services that their children might be receiving, and have the tools they need to support their children through their experience. And then, of course, those attorney services we see are actually increasing over the last 3 years, as we saw with DV services. So we hypothesize a little bit in the report that this increase in attorney services could be related to a pilot program that was launched in the last few years, and went over quite successfully, which has, suggested we might expand more legal aid services to survivors of sexual assault specifically. I know that was a ton of information, and you have a large report ahead of you for anyone interested in reading about it in greater detail. But we want to say thank you for being here today and for taking the time to learn a little bit about all the incredible work that our community has done in the last year. So often, our conversations really focus on the need, which is ever present and ever growing. But it feels, I think, quite heartwarming for us to be able to just uplift all of the incredible work that happens every day among service providers. We want to invite you to stay connected to our team and to the Measuring Safety project. Rather, you can scan this QR code to hop over to our website, where you can access copies of this report, as well as other reports we've produced this year. You can sign up for our mailing list and stay in the know as we publish new reports. And you can access our social media toolkit as well. We also want to invite our members in the room to mark your calendars. We are hosting an end of year Measuring Safety community celebration this December 10th. More details on registration to come. But we hope it will be a space to have really productive feedback about this year's report cycle, as well as get your input on what next year's reports might cover. We'll also have a sneak peek for you of some of the things we already have in the works. So we would love your feedback, and we think your feedback makes this project better every year, and would love to have you present with us.
Thanks again, everyone. And again, a copy of this recording can be found on our website, our YouTube page, The report is available for download, but please don't hesitate to reach out with any further questions, comments, and we hope to see you at our future launches next year.